Okay, well, we can get started now then. So it's already 1:03. And okay, so first, just to introduce myself, my name is Miriam Sanuab, and I am the Writing Relations Coordinator for Winnipeg. And so we've been working on food, talking about food sovereignty, and also we've been sponsored by the Sustainability Grant, um, which is the Agenda 2030 by the Government of Canada. And also maybe just to have a little bit of a housekeeping items, just to make sure that you're muted, just so that we can hear the person who's speaking. And also, I guess you could also maybe if you could maybe try to leave your camera on. I mean, just for during the presentation. And also, we also do have an evaluation form as well too that we will be that we will have probably on a chat box. So if you could fill that out when the presentation is over, and that would be great. And just to have the feedback from you, and so what we have our guest here. Her name is Audrey Logan. Audrey Logan is Cree Métis from Northern Alberta, and she's been living here in Winnipeg. And so she has a garden just out, like in West Broadway, permaculture. And also she's been also pretty active on Facebook as well, talking about dehydration. She has a website called Dehydration Nation as well. And so yeah, so just I guess we can help me welcome Audrey Logan. She's going to be doing her talk, the work that she does around hydration, around food sovereignty, and we're excited to have her. And so, Audrey, you have the floor.
Well, thank you so very much for the acknowledgments, as well as um, understanding that our role as land stewards has been generational. And when I met my birth family, I found out that they too had generational knowledge and something that is a colonial aspect that if you're not raised with it, you don't know it. But as when I met my auntie Katie Sanderson, she said, "You know what? You grew up with it. It was in your blood. It's in all of our blood. The DNA aspect of growing food, as well as our many talents, as making baskets or being a candle maker or a soap maker or whichever maker you are. It was basically in your DNA initially. So I'm loving that aspect because I went for training as a dental assistant, but turned out to be a person of roots of a different kind. And it's been wonderful as a way to connect back to my blood knowledge, of being able to not only survive but thrive. Because in our present systems, people on disability are not given the funds in order to be able to do so. We get $3.95 a day for food, and that is not enough to um, be able to, become healthy again, or to be able to thrive and overcome some of our illnesses. So when they told me I was, at 310 pounds and um, being borderline diabetic, I was like, oh no, I can't do this. I can't allow this to happen. And as I lay in my bed going, what can I do about this? I don't have land. I don't have places to grow like my Auntie Katie or my Cookum or others. And then it came to me like, what makes you think you have to have land of your own when you have neighbors who don't use it? Or, the aspect um, of others who don't make use of other fruits and stuff that they have in their own yard. So I started doing local foraging, which has been able to help me to be able to, excuse me, I'm trying to click this thing. Uh, yes, I see someone else here in my view, but anyway, um, I started utilizing these different methods. So with our traditional method of growing, I started using the permaculture method, which helped me to be able to grow um, throughout the year more than just once. And so, like even autumn, in August there I will seed carrots, and I've gotten in the end of October some fresh, beautiful young carrots. So I utilize the Seven Sisters method as well as our non-colonial method of not tilling the soil, but being able to direct seed and such. So, like, even though right now people are like, "Oh, I didn't seed in August in the beginning of May." Well, it's okay. I've seeded zucchinis in the middle of July and still got zucchinis that didn't look any different from the ones I did in May. And so, we can reproduce and produce for many. It does not matter the time of year. What matters more, I think, on the method used. The westernized method is tilling of the soil, which is very killing to our natural ways, and it's just not as productive as our traditional ways of many know the three sisters, but there turns out to be seven sisters, and each one of them in its own way has been able to help each other to be able to produce and helpful in many ways. But today, I will be talking no more about what do you do with all that produce, because there's lots that once you get to going and growing, and people like, oh well, I don't need this, I don't need that, but in reality, you can make use of this and that. So, like carrot tops, most people cut the tops off and throw them away. Those carrot tops, you can dry them, as well as beet tops, as well as leaf of the bean flower, and such, and make it into what is called green flour, vegetable flour, and that has helped our people for millennia. And the reason I say that is because we have an archaeologist, Dr. Lee Sims, who helped confirm that. And in confirmation, he was able to say that and show that our people had been growing and knowing of our native fauna for thousands of years. In the stomach of a mammoth, they found seeds that were once cultivated by indigenous people and ones that were not. So they were able to differentiate seeds of those, saying, "Oh, well, this is a non-cultivated seed, so it is smaller. It has a thicker coat, whereas the ones who had been already cultivated by indigenous peoples were larger and a thinner coat, which we see now today." even, and uh, and that led him to a lifelong acknowledgement that Indigenous people were very much farmers here for thousands of years, as well as they knew and shared that knowledge amongst all the peoples throughout North America and South America, because Winnipeg was known as a meeting place, and it wasn't just for meeting and saying, "Hey, how you doing?" but as much as saying, "Hey, what you got?" And so many of the pot shards that they found up north also carried the what they call phytoliths, the scientific names for um, microscopic um, pollens and microscopic analysis of food that was grown in or cooked in those pots. And the list was very large. Even he was taken aback by the amount of uh, foodstuffs that were in that pot in itself. Uh, and that, really kind of takes away from the ideology that Europeans came and settled this land or uh, came here and farmed and created archaeology of, farming. Our people were farming here long before that, way long. And I asked them personally, I said, well, what happened? You know, why did we no longer become farmers and considered to be just, you know, hunter gatherers? He said, well, it was because that during the first initial incursion here into North America, 9 out of 10 people had died from disease. So when you lose your base of productivity in people, you then are left with what? The few people that survived. And so Europeans had not recognized the factor of indigenous agriculture because it was not done in grows and huge fields like they do. Our fields were filled with 3 or 4 different items, and our fields were like 100 acres or more. Uh, and that is based a lot on George Washington, who actually made note of burning down a couple 100 acres of food growth, saying, I'm going to drive these people out. And the native people were like, yeah, whatever. Because they already had in ground granaries, which have been found even as at Lockport in Manitoba, just north of the bridge there. Um, those are in ground granaries that were, they figure at least ones you can be able to stand in, so at least 5 to 6 feet deep. And that's where they stored their grains and stored their seeds and stored their dried food items. So when it comes to dried food items, you go like, wow, why would they do that? Well, when you look at European standards of preserving foods, a lot of it has to do with salt or vinegars, and or as well as heat preserving, such as jarring and canning and stuff like that. Canning only is actually rather new. That only came in the past uh, 60 plus years. So it's not really, a historical way of preserving food, whereas our own people had been preserving food in the method of, sorry, the method of dehydration for thousands of years. And how do we know that? Well, there again, the archaeology has been able to prove that By scanning and scraping the pots, they were able to discern that, oh, this pot had at least 300 different plant materials as well as mountain goat. Well, where do you find mountain goat in Manitoba? Not too many places. So it as well showed that we were also Pan American trade. So we had trade amongst the indigenous peoples from far south to far north of foodstuffs, which helped our people in many ways to be able to live and survive. And when the Europeans arrived, many of them came unprepared. And unprepared means that they did not know the climate, they did not know the environment. And so, like the Selkirk Settlement is what it was called initially by, the settlement that was created by Lord Selkirk, which actually spans from Ontario through Manitoba, through Saskatchewan into Alberta, as well as north into Northwest Territories and south into to the what's now known as the Dakotas. And their initial settlements would have perished, and they were on the brink of it. But the women of Peguis asked the chief to be able to send over to them gifts of dried produce. And that dried produce then was utilized by the Selkirk settlement in their vegetable flour, dried meat, dried fish, which helped them be able to get through that winter and be able to survive. Because otherwise, they would have died just like the other settlements that came over uh, previously in other parts of North America. Each one ended up being saved by our indigenous peoples uh, and ways of food preserving. So I myself, way back in 2010, earlier than that, a little bit of local foraging and such. I had changed over my westernized diet to more traditional. And I went from 310 pounds and very unhealthy and borderline diabetic to being no longer diabetic and a lot less weight on me and a lot healthier because I switched over to our traditional foods and foraging. And I'm in the middle of the city. I don't have the farmland or the indigenous forest to forage from. But I realize I do have here right in the middle of the city. So as my Auntie Katie Sanderson said, it does not matter where you are. What matters is what you do. And so I came to realize, yeah, there's people with apple trees and cherries and raspberries and grapes and black currants, red currants, and all those type of things are growing in people's yards. And half the time they don't use them. So I started knocking on doors and saying, hey, I would love to take care of this plant if you would allow me to use this produce. And by and large, 99% of people said, yeah, go ahead. I'm too busy in this, eh, you know, environment to be able to do that. So go ahead and make use. And to me, that's land stewardship, which is what Indigenous peoples have always been, is not about controlling the land as much as steering it to what it is meant to be used. And so I started doing that. And I have not really relied upon the store products for at least 13 years now, which has saved me a lot of money. um, any monies I do have now can go towards paying for ecologically healthy meats that complement my green materials. And as well as making your own fruit roll-ups, they're so good. You don't have to add sugars, and it's so sweet or tart, whichever the fruit itself is. Like rhubarb, I was tired one day and I had a whole bunch of rhubarb because my daughter has, like huge amount of plants from it from previous owners of the land, and he was not, being able to utilize all of it. So I would gather it, and one day I had a whole too much of it. I was like, "Yep, that's it. I'm drying you." So I sliced them thin and put them in the dehydrator. And then, as my auntie said, our people were ones who adapted to whatever we were presented with. So I put them in the Vitamix, powdered them, and then we're able to use that rhubarb powder in some of my sweets and treats as a topping, as well as to cover meats when I was roasting. And wow, what flavor I was able to attain because of doing that. So I was able to have this, tart sweet, but also I could like rim a glass with water and then dip it into that powder and then have an awesome tea for summer, as well as, utilizing the plant material not just for cooking, but enjoyment in relaxation. So, like some of the mints as well. Mint is a coolant, so I would infuse that into my coconut oil, then apply that as a salve, and that help cool the skin. Mind you, you smell like peppermint patty, so to say, but at least then your body's cooled down. You apply that into your uh, what do you call that? Veins that are very more exposed to the skin, as the jugular veins, as well as the thigh veins and your wrists. I apply a little bit to that, and a little bit to this, a little bit to the inner part of the thighs, and it helps cool me down. And there's so much can be utilized by our dehydration. And dehydration only removes a small amount of nutrition, as in well, cooking or heat processing, which is part of your pickling and preserves. You lose a lot because uh, with preserves you have to use a lot of sugar. With pickling, you have to use a lot of vinegar and salt, which introduces that highly into the body. And with dehydration, you actually only lose up to 14%, whereas the others you can lose 60 to 80% of your nutritional value from that processing. And because I have a disability where I have a neck injury, so hand repetition was very challenging. I found that by dehydrating, I only have to do it once a year when things are in season. And when things are in season, I slice and then dry it. And using our modern machinery, very easy to do. And you don't always have to have a dehydrator indoors. My first dehydrator was a couple racks that I got from the Dollarama in front of a south facing window with an oscillating fan. So solar and wind power worked really good for this. And then, as I was able to have more of an area to do so, I would just set up racks of window screens and, have them on rack upon rack and draped over just to, keep down the dust and stuff from the city environment. Um, was able to drape that over top of it. And then within a day, they were dry. And I found that root vegetables though take a little bit longer. And so the next day I would bring them out from under a covering and allow them to do a second day of drying. But initially, personally, I was like, oh, I got to have lots of tins. I gotta have lots of areas to put this. In reality, I didn't. Um, Turns out that my 10 pounds of carrots for the winter, I didn't even get through the 10 pounds of carrots. So the 40 pounds of carrots that I did a couple years ago are going to do me for at least a couple years, and which is great. Uh, but it also lets you know that you don't have to do this all the time, every year. You can do a good amount one year, and the dehydration action actually will preserve the food for up to 50 years or more. So all we're doing is removing the moisture from that product. And then I graduated not just to doing our vegetables and dried greens, but also meat and fish. And so I make my own natural beef broth, bone broth, where I have some here. And what I do is I made some uh, neck bones and other bones of whether it be beef, lamb, you know, and other goods. I would make my broth from it, and then skim the fat off by putting it in the fridge, and then the next day take the fat off, and what's left underneath, I would scoop it out and put it onto my dehydrator, what they call silicone mats or parchment paper, and dehydrate it, and then I got my own bouillon, you know, which you can make into an awesome gravy, as well as soup additive or any kind of thing that you would naturally add into a bouillon. And it also allowed me the ability to be able to preserve many things that most likely would have gone bad. But like celery, you dry celery, it's actually very salty. So that can add into your food stuffs without adding the salt aspect. And so it's been quite a journey into our food sovereignty and how our indigenous people were able to uh, be self-sufficient and not reliant upon anybody or anything because they had these methods of dehydration, which allowed people like myself. I use squash for flour, and it makes a very nutty, sweet tasting flour that I can make into a tortilla or add it into my soups as a thickener, or even just chunks of squash into it during the winter, which then give me the good vitamins and minerals that I need. And it's just been when one talks about freedom or sovereignty, that's how I feel. I feel very much a sovereign aspect to being able to avoid having to buy the westernized food. Like I said, I've hardly been in the store in 13 years, but many of the things I utilize, I've grown myself or locally harvest, and you know, dried tomatoes. I can take those and add water, use a little puree thing, and I got tomato soup. Okay, fruit roll-ups. Talk about fruit roll-ups. Oh my goodness. These ones are made of um, native native cherries, which are quite tart. So you don't have to add sugar, you don't have to add salt or anything, but with it you get quite a bit of a goodness from it because there again it's the pure product. So people say, "Oh, don't you add sugar?" No, don't need to. You can if you want to, but there again, I can take a piece of this and put it into a cup with some warm water, use my puree, boom, I got jam. Add a little bit more water, boom, I got juice. You know, or when I want to cook something with some meat with a little bit of flavor, I can add this to the meat and create a nice natural flavor to our meats. And so, uh, you know, you can't really go amiss with this method because it really is so, what can I say? It's so in living aspect, you know, that I can make use of whatever greens I gather. When I look at a package that a friend had at the place there anyway, and it was 1 cup, and in this one jar and cup was dried greens for their smoothies. And I looked at that dried greens and I'm going, oh, they got dried beets, they've got dried carrot tops, they got dried beet tops, they've got quite a few other greens and such that I naturally forage. But they were charging $40. There's one little cup worth of stuff. I've got 5 gallon pails full of it. and and so it you can replace that cost by just dehydrating your own as well as others. I've had other people who've dropped in and said, hey, I got a bunch of carrot tops, you need them? Sure. I dry them and then I add that into my green flour. And green flour in the sense of vegetable flour, you still have the nutritional value without having the excess chemicalized aspect that you normally would have gotten if you had bought it from a store in a bag. Because we can't really blame the system of stores because they do have to be able to have their vegetation be able to make it more than a week. So carrots in the store that you buy will usually have what's called a spray of debud, and debud is a chemical that stops the plant from sprouting. And so your carrots could last, right up until January in a bag. But in reality, ones from the farm or naturalized carrots usually last only 4 or 5 days. And I dehydrated both just to see what the differences would be. And the ones from the store, when I rehydrated them, very bitter. Very, it did not really have a good carrot taste. And that was because there again, I was more consuming of the chemical than I was of the natural product. Whereas when I did ones straight from the garden and straight from the farmer, they were when I rehydrated them, they were sweet as could be, and even to the point that I had to be careful how many carrots I added to my stew or and such because otherwise it could overtake the scent and the taste of carrot. And I was just amazed in that change and that factor aspect of what we spray and how we grow things really changes the flavor. And since I've been off of westernized foods, my tongue no longer has the coating that it used to have, which protected it from those chemical reactions. So, of more chemicalized fruit and foods. So now I'm more able to taste and feel that natural goodness of each of them. Initially, I couldn't because there again, I had my tongue had been coated for decades with a a protective layer to protect it from the Dorito burn and a few other you know chemical aspects. And so now that that wore off, now I can taste the flavor of those foods, which is why they say, oh, when people switch over to natural foods, they go, oh, it's so bland. I can't taste it. Yeah, well, give it time for your tongue to switch over from being overly protective to protecting from those chemicals to being more naturalized, where it can now recognize the natural foods and the natural things you're feeding yourself. And I also found that the Western way, 3 meals a day is the norm, but with our uh, once I switched over, I only eat once a day actually. I don't need or feel the need to eat 3 times a day because I'm not eating empty calories. I'm eating very high nutritional foods to where once a day is enough. I've tried before to take it beyond that, and yeah, I just end up with a fuller stomach and the body going, "What the heck? We can't we can't process this all at once because it's so nutrient dense that we actually only need to eat them once a day." So that in itself cut down my need for food daily to where because on disability we get $3.95 a day for food. There's no one who can survive on that really in any way, shape, or form, let alone deal with a medical issue when it comes to food nutrition. So a lot of people say, "Oh, well, you just need to go to a better market or this and that." I had all kinds of so-called advice at the time, but once I switched over to our traditional ways, I only, like I said, once a day, and every fourth day I actually do fast because my body needs needs to loosen whatever's in it because it is so concentrated, and it's helped me a lot. Even pemmican. Pemmican is not just meat and berries ground up together, dry. We do have a video on that at Dehydration Nations, and the the item that we're working with, as in dried meat, which is your protein, doesn't always have to be meat. It can also be dried beans. So beans that have been cooked and then dehydrated, you can dry them and use them as the protein aspect. So for ones who are non-meat eaters, uh, they can still, be able to make a consumable product that does not have to be cooked, is already been cooked. Uh, and they can use it on the go when you're biking or hiking or camping or whichever. Put a little bit in your cheek, allow the natural juices to flow, and you will have the essence of that food absorbed in the body. And ones who have contacted me back going, "Wow, all of a sudden I'm biking along and I can taste blueberries or mushroom or beans or whichever," but that gives you that also that powerful food feeding to your muscles and your body, which is needed, right? And there's times that I've gone to workshops and there's things in the past, and a lot of things that we're feeding people for lunches and such, I couldn't eat. I couldn't eat them because it consisted of a lot of chemicals or just made me feel bloated afterwards. And then when I started just carrying my own pemmican, which is, you know, a variation of vegetables and meats and such, and berries and nuts, it did me a lot better. And I could just take a little pinch of that, put it in my cheek, and talk while they're all talking, having their lunch. And and there again, it to me it's a way of freedom too. You know, we are in an oppressive system of poverty, and not just First Nations, but anyone on disability, anyone who is low income knows what it's like to have to bypass the good meats and end up eating more carbs, and because they're cheap. But cheap doesn't necessarily make it good. So by adding into their diet the dried meats or the dried fish or the dried vegetables or dried fruit uh, can really help along with that. And when people say, well, where'd you get your apples for that? You know, it's a lot in the store. Well, you know how many apple trees there are in Winnipeg? A heck of a lot. And so all you do have to do is knock on a door. Say, hey, can I pick the apples off that are dropped or whatever? And, um, you know, utilize that aspect. If they have excess flowers that need deadheading, I would go and knock on the door and say, hey, I notice you have a lot of bee balm. And bee balm is, it's got its own natural spiciness to it. So I like to cook meats, our native meats with it, but also as a tea. And they go, oh, I have no clue. I just bought them at the store. They're an annual, and go ahead. And so I would deadhead and take off the spent flowers and make use of that for a tea or there again to cook meats with. It adds like a what they call like a chai tea, I guess they would call it. Chai tea is kind of spicy but yet not hot. And your bee balm and monarda really do that well. So utilizing these foods and our foodstuffs that our indigenous people have been utilizing for thousands of years have been able to help me personally uh, be able to uh, adapt more to the imposing poverty that happens with many people in low income or disability. And if I figured, and friends of mine figured, hey, if you can do it, and you're low income, and you're, you know, uh, in the so-called destitute, then what you have, you can share with others. And so they created the Facebook page, Dehydration Nations, as well as a clinic garden group, clinic with a K, to show how I utilize the method of growing, which is more indigenous led to being what they call Westerners called permaculture, but we call it just natural growing. And so we don't dig, we don't till, and it's always produced very well. And so I said, yeah, okay. And they created the page, Dehydration Nations, to where I share on how to dry things, how to utilize it, and rehydrate it. And I find it so much better to be able to do that because our knowledge is meant to be shared. It's not meant to be hidden anymore because it's no longer against the, the law to share our knowledge. Uh, we have to acknowledge the fact that it was against the law at one time to have what was called potlatches or giving ceremonies, where leaders or people of the community who had excess amounts of food and such would be allowed to give to the community uh, their allotment. That became illegal. And that became illegal because of the Indian Act. And the Indian Act, if you do chance to take a look at it, which very few people have, but if you do, look under the agricultural um, series of it, and you will see how much is very much apartheid, to the point that that explains why Indigenous people were no longer allowed to grow their food or share their food or sell their food and grow them out of the economy uh, of, of such stuff. It's disturbing at times so when I see people selling bison, but they're not Indigenous at all. And the Indigenous people themselves are not allowed to sell bison meat or other things without government permits and a whole menagerie of roadblocks, right? We need to take those roadblocks down. If it's okay for this other person to have an elk farm and sell their elk meat, then why is it illegal for Indigenous people to go out and hunt and share their meat? You know, we need to break down those divides. Uh, I was recently gifted some meat, dried meat from Calgary and in Alberta there, and it's called Pan Salon. They're one of the few companies that actually are Indigenous food, and as well as the dehydration aspect was gifted also to by the elders in the community to be able to say yes, we approve of this because more people need to be able to taste our foods and our traditional ways. And I'm going to open this one up because I got my own. My own, I do a little bit thinner than these, but this dried meat can then be taken and oh, it smells so good. That smell and that scent is maple. And once you break these pieces off and put it into like a stew or any kind of moisture there, it's going to release that scent. But then the meat itself will be almost like bacon. Yeah, so it's got that texture of bacon, but your whole house will smell like bacon. So whatever you do roast or dehydrate with the maple will have that bacon scent. And this one's a little bit thicker than what I normally do, but the amount of energy and protein in this is tremendous. And like I said, it's not going to go bad. I can keep it in this container for 20, 30 years, and it will not lose its nutritional value, which is lovely because, I can just break a piece off, pop that in my mouth, and let it rehydrate my cheek and slowly absorb that nutritional value. This one is wonderful taste. If you've ever had dried meat, I like dry mine by slicing it super thin, and the meat has like a sweetness to it. And at first, I thought, oh, geez, I forgot to put that teriyaki sauce or this sauce to make it jerky. But by drying in and of itself, it was delicious on its own. It had its own sweetness and its own flavor and its own purity of being, you know. So I greatly treasured this gift that was given, and just like I've done other workshops where I've instead of asking for money or anything, because I'm not one to be bought, but I do share, and they brought me maple syrup, and that maple syrup I then used to dehydrate fish in. I take the fish and I soak it in that over 3 or 4 days at least to allow the maple syrup to really get into the flesh of the fish. And then we take it out, cut it into bits, then dehydrate it, and then you have fish candy. You can do that with meat too, right? So I could easily take this and dehydrate it somewhat with maple syrup and have my candied meat, which then you get your nutritional value without the excess sugar. But yeah, it's a delicious way to preserve our foods. In fact, the NASA was very much interested in figuring out on how to make their dried goods for the astronauts because taking fresh food up up into space is not necessarily doable, right? So by dehydrating everything, they get put it into bags and then adding water rehydrates, and then they have their meals. So dehydration has been not only around for millennia, but also um, very much new if you choose to go into it. Um, I make fruit roll-ups from apples. My daughter's apple tree. Last year, I got um, 3 5-gallon pails full of apple chips, which is just sliced apples and dehydrated, and then also 25 fruit roll-ups, which is very large, actually, a tray of it, and then also from it, from the cores and peelings from it, I was able to make my apple cider vinegar, so nothing goes to waste. As well as once I was making the vinegar, once I finished making the vinegar, I would take that apple cider or apple bits and then put that into my worm composting, which then turns back into soil. So there was really a no waste method and totally ecologically safe and sound, and we get more than one product from it. So for me, I don't have to go out and buy all these little containers full of flower or vegetation, whereas you know beforehand I used to. Now I can make a good jar full of whether it be berries and such. These ones are sour cherries. They have their own stickiness to them. I like to move them around once a bit, get that airflow to keep them dry. They are quite tart, but if I need to, I can just put them into a cup with water. They rehydrate, and then I can use them for a pie or a tart or you know topping for anything really. We're only limited by our imagination, as I call it, and it's really helped me a lot in our there again because of our low income aspect, and now with the pandemic, you know we need to find ways to preserve our foods. And jarring and canning for me was just too challenging in the sense of I couldn't do up the jars because my hands taken up to a certain temperature does not always mean it's safe. And I figured, why make it so much harder for myself? Why not just dry it? That way, when I need peppers for or this and that for let's say what they call a Montreal spice for meat or for a dry rub, I just dry the peppers that I've been able to grow or got from the Good Food Club market and dry that and add that in. And then it's real. It's far more nutritious, you know. And pardon me, I got to pick up these little bits because we don't like to waste nothing. And it's so good, you know. And our natural treats, to me, it, it feeds our ancestral DNA aspect, because many people have been recently acknowledging the fact of what they call blood knowledge. And blood knowledge to me means that once you're reintroduced to traditional foods and such, your DNA recognizes it and starts popping up, going, "Hey, I recognize that," you know, for some reason, and it feels good, and we can get vitamins going and such. But then also the historical memories start coming back to you, and then next thing you know, you're going, "Well, I don't need to go to the store for a can of beans. I just can get some dried beans." And then put them in the slow cooker with a little bit of this and that, and you get your natural dried beans or bean nutrition from it without having to buy a can of beans. Can of beans, yes, and it's part of the economy, but for the amount that I can get from 1 kilo of or 1 pound or 2 pounds worth of dried beans is that'd be far more nutritious than one that has been cooked in a big vat, who knows where, and the carbon input of transporting it and cooking it elsewhere and then bringing it here. I can make my own, you know, and so much more flavor. And I had someone try come over and before the pandemic there, of course, and they had tried some of my beans. They're like, "Oh, what brand is this? These beans are so good." And I'm like, "That's my brand." I just I cook the dried beans and the natural juices there with a little bit of plant material for flavoring, and did a good 24-hour cooking, and they were so naturally thick and wonderful that she actually thought it was from a can, but it wasn't. And it felt good to be able to share that with her, because then she was like, "Oh, I'm going to try this." And you can find, natural bean sources, um, places like those Zacos on Sargent here in Winnipeg, Bulk Barn. I've gone to Bulk Barn and got some black turtle beans and even planted them. And those black turtle beans produced more beans for me, but not just green beans, but then I allowed them to go to seed, and then got my next supply of beans to where I don't have to go there anymore and buy some black beans, because now I'm growing my own. So it opens up a lot of avenues of just natural awareness, of self, and not just self, but how we fit into that natural order of things. As our people were land stewards, we steered the land. We didn't control the land as much as we steered it to what it was capable of doing. And we had Pan American trade. So even if we didn't grow certain things, we knew that during the years of trade, people would come up and bring their goods. People would trade for items, and that was carried easily because they dehydrated it. So squash flour was easily dehydrated, ground up, and put into bags, which of course our people were making it of natural sources for their area, and being able to hold that no matter how far, right? And it just, I just find it so comforting to know that even though there was a snowstorm that happened before the pandemic and the pandemic, that I've not had to rely upon the store or the urgency to attend one, or to have emergency food because in all my jars that I have, I've got fruit, I've got meat, I got dried fish. All I have to do is rehydrate, put it into a little slow cooker, and I got a stew, I got a soup, or I can make it into whatever I want. I've sliced the zucchini lengthwise, dried it, and those I can use for a vegetable um, lasagna just by adding a little extra water to rehydrate and put that in the oven. And boom, I got a really good meal without having to compromise my health extra because of it. And it's been really for me reclaiming my ancestral knowledge as well as ways of food production and freedom. And and with that, well, after a good hour here, and I'm willing to now share the floor with others who wish to maybe ask some questions, because what I shared with you is going to be like quite a few years worth of knowledge put into an hour. And so, yeah, if there's any questions or ideas about things,